Thanks, Gloria. Remember to keep muted. And one other thing I wish to say is throughout the talks, if there is anything you wish to say or any question you wish to ask, please put that in the chat. So you may do that during the conversations and during the breakouts. And now I have great pleasure in introducing our first speaker, Asha Sidhu. Asha has been in education for over 20 years. She has been in senior leadership roles for over 6 years, having worked in both the maintained and the independent sectors. Among a number of other responsibilities, she has been responsible for the pupil premium, pupil progress, and curriculum. Asha has worked as a diocesan inspector whilst teaching science and religious education. She has always been concerned about the progress of our disadvantaged pupils and welcomed the government's initiative to look in more detail at pupil exclusion. And today, Asha will examine the various issues surrounding school exclusions, the Timpson Review, ethnic minorities, alternative provision, and other relevant matters. I give to you now, Asha.
Thank you, Yogi. Thank you for signing up to this workshop. And thank you to Yogi and Richard for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts and reflections around exclusions. I'm going to share my screen. Let's get this on. Okay, lovely. To exclude a pupil is to change the life trajectory that pupil is on. For many pupils, it is for the better, where they can access high quality education and facilities with reputations for exceptional parental engagement, which in turn leads to better outcomes than they would have achieved in a mainstream school. However, for others, it's for the worse, where the pupil subsequently fails to secure any qualification and at the age of 18 falls into the category of NEET, not in education, employment or training. In March 2018, Edward Timpson, Conservative MP for Cheshire West and Cheshire Council, was commissioned to review school exclusion by the Secretary of State for Education. And in May 2019, the Timpson Review of School Exclusion was published. The review confirmed what many already knew. Some student groups were more likely to be excluded than others, and there was variation in how fairly and consistently head teachers used exclusions that went beyond the influence of local context. In addition, some head teachers even unlawfully excluded pupils. However, like most, I do believe head teachers must continue to have some autonomy and discretion to use exclusion where appropriate, but only as a last resort when all other interventions and strategies have failed. Why? Simply because there are some children who, for whatever reason, be it in school or out of school factors, are unable to meet the standard expected of behaviour and interaction in a mainstream school. Timpson acknowledged this and concluded his review with 30 recommendations. Then the pandemic hit. Although the government has made some progress and implemented 6 of the 30 recommendations, urgent action on the rest is still needed. In this talk, I will dive deeper, to use an Ofsted term, into the data on exclusions, touch on what we believe a Catholic education offers, and cover 3 of the 30 recommendations, which I believe, once actioned by Parliament, may be the driving force in lowering school exclusions over the coming years. For the purpose of this talk, I will use Timpson's definition of an alternative provision, or AP, as follows. Education arranged by local authorities for pupils of compulsory school age outside of mainstream or special schools, who would not otherwise receive suitable education for any reason. This includes pupils with behaviour problems, with health needs, preventing school attendance, or without a school place. This may include full or part-time placements in PRUs, AP academies, AP free schools, hospitals, special schools, FE colleges, independent schools, and other provisions such as home tuition services and voluntary or private sector providers. And so the statistics. Almost 50% of pupils in APs in alternative provisions are in year 11.
Sorry, Asha, could you just move your screen slightly?
Yeah, let me
We're not getting
move this right down, see if that makes a difference. Does that? Yes. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, most children in the UK will have missed over half a school year of in-person schooling since the pandemic hit. This equates to about 5% of a pupil's entire time in school. Last month, Timpson reported to Parliament that in part of his constituency, there is already a rising use of school exclusions following the ending of the restrictions, which he fears may be reflected in different parts of the country. If this is the case, then potentially even more pupils in year 11 are being excluded after having missed at least half a school year between years 9 and 10.
Excuse me, Asha. Sorry,
yes.
Some people are not seeing the full screen. Is there anything you can do to? Some people are seeing others.
What are they missing? I'm not.
It's half. It's in half. So for some reason, it's.
Is that better?
Yes, that's wonderful. Yes, thank you very much.
Gosh, I wonder what that was. I couldn't tell you. Okay, so going back to the statistics, consider pupil A, currently in year 10, who has just returned from a 2-day exclusion following a serious altercation in the playground. He is in a very good chemistry lesson. It's important to note that pupil A comes from a disadvantaged background and over the pandemic suffered a bereavement, which has also hit the family financially. The teacher is consolidating the learning with exam-style questions. Pupil A's eyes glaze over and he thinks about the situation at home. During the pandemic, he would watch YouTube clips for hours to get his mind off what was going on. The school has a no mobile phone policy, and so when he is given a differentiated worksheet, the good teachers notice his lack of engagement and has provided a slightly easier set of scaffolded questions. He simply puts his head on the table and pretends to sleep. After being asked repeatedly by the teacher to sit up and refusing even to acknowledge the teacher's presence, a senior leader is called and pupil A is removed from the lesson. As staff try to engage with him and find out what is going on, he becomes increasingly angry as he knows that they can't do anything about his situation at home. At one point, he snaps, lashes out, and is excluded again for 1 day. And the cycle of lost learning and dimmer chances for education recovery continue. Legally, a pupil can be given up to 45 days of fixed term exclusions over 1 academic year. This equates to roughly 292 hours of lost learning. In that time, I could teach all 170 concepts for the IGCSE chemistry syllabus and still have time to deliver revision sessions, assessments, and move on to cover half of the biology IGCSE syllabus. And is there a future financial impact on these pupils? Well, according to Robert Halfron, Conservative MP for Harlow, who addressed Parliament earlier this year on the issue of education recovery, he indicated that lost learning on pupils has structural consequences that could result in lost earnings of as much as 3.4% in their lifetime. That translates to a loss of between £26,500 and £52,300 in their earning potential. Very few people can afford to lose that much money, even over a lifetime of working. Is it surprising then that only 4.5% of year 11 pupils in alternative provisions achieve a level 9 to 5 in English and maths, compared to 65% in mainstream schools? I'm not sure how to move this. I'll leave that one here for now. As more data is generated following the pandemic, many good schools are revisiting their pastoral support of pupils and are committed to deliver targeted training for staff, including bereavement training, to help them get better at identifying earlier the signs of perhaps trauma, heightened anxiety, and social disconnection, to list a few of the needs presented by pupils to staff in schools now. These issues have been bottled up at home, need addressing so that schools can help pupils at risk of exclusion down a different path to pupil A. Pupils need to know they are secure, safe, and have worth, and that the school will support them until the end of year 11, not least as the academic outcomes for pupils in alternative provisions in year 11 are stark. In St. Claudine's Catholic School for Girls, head teacher Louise McGowan introduced bereavement training for staff following unprecedented numbers of deaths in the families of students in her school. You can find all of the podcast and the interviews on the Bishop's Conference. It's titled Grief in the Classroom. Over 40% of pupils in alternative provisions are eligible for free school meals. According to Ofqual, there was a slight widening of the long-standing results gap in England between pupils in receipt of free school meals and those who are not. The gap has been a persistent problem, but has been gradually closing for 10 years. In 2020, it stalled, and this year has grown slightly. Let's consider our pupils in alternative provisions who are eligible for free school meals. Not only are they facing the widening gap in attainment, but they also have a 95.5% chance of failing to secure level 5 or above in English and maths if they are in year 11. According to Andy Carter, Conservative MP for Warrington South, too many alternative provisions are based in buildings passed down by local authorities, or in schools no longer used for mainstream pupils. Others are in such a state of disrepair that they look like last chance saloons. We must ask ourselves, why would we place some of our most vulnerable children into neglected premises and old converted houses? Most teachers use their learning environments, the classroom and corridor displays, to engage and promote learning. As you know, schools prepare very seriously today for open days for prospective parents and pupils. Environment matters. So why does it not appear to matter as much for pupils in alternative provisions? Andy Carter heard from many parents who said that turning up to alternative provision schools that look like dumping grounds further raises anxiety about being placed in an alternative provision. This is true for both parents and their children. Post-pandemic, will we be sending more pupils eligible for free school meals to such buildings? Remember, alternative provisions take pupils at any point in the academic year if they have a place available. This means that sometimes excluded pupils are not placed in the alternative provision of choice, but sometimes in an alternative provision that looks like a last chance saloon. Should our Catholic schools still exclude pupils, even when they know that they will be sending them to an alternative provision site not fit for purpose? And what about the pupil premium funding? According to Robert Halfron, the Sutton Trust says that 34% of pupil premium funding is being used to plug gaps in school budgets to fix leaky roofs, for example. This is immoral, especially if schools who do not use the funding exclusively for pupil premium students exclude pupil premium students. And how about the recent substantial refund to schools and colleges from exam boards who would have spent money on exams before they were cancelled? The boards didn't have to create, print, or mark exam papers. This meant that last year, OCR, one of the several exam boards, gave back a total of £7.9 million, while AQA, the UK's largest provider of academic qualifications, returned 42 million to schools and colleges, a rebate of approximately 25%. It is suggested that as much as 50% will be refunded this year. What will schools do with those refunds? There is a strong ethical argument for that rebate to be used to fund additional learning for disadvantaged pupils who are reaching critical exam years or have missed out on the key skills in early years. Are our Catholic schools taking a lead? Will we find innovation and vibrant programs supporting pupils who have fallen behind to move their progress on? I can only hope so. According to the Timpson Review, 79% of pupils in alternative provision have a special educational need or a disability. This is compared to 14.6% in maintained schools. Even more concerning is that 11.2% of pupils in alternative provisions have an educational healthcare plan, compared to 2.9% in maintained schools. There is clearly an overrepresentation of pupils with SEN in alternative provisions. Current statistics indicate that remote learning was especially difficult for children with special educational needs and disabilities. In fact, it appears that disadvantaged pupils have overall experienced greater learning losses of as much as 7 months in both reading and maths. When will these pupils have a chance to catch up? In the September debate on the Timpson Review of School Exclusions, Rachel Maskell, Labour MP for York Central and chair of the all-party parliamentary group for adoption and permanence, emphasised the importance of schools being able to identify early indicators for children at risk of exclusion. She said that children who experience adoption are 20 times more likely to be permanently excluded. The statistics for the EHCPs support this. Here, the trauma of exclusion builds upon the history of the trauma already experienced in that child's life. We know many students with special educational needs are unconventional thinkers, possibly even creative thinkers, who do not think in the same way or process information in the same way. It is a fact that many pupils who have been excluded are more likely to go on to be identified as having SEN, special educational needs, after the exclusion. By that point, it is too late, and the opportunity for these pupils to develop their abilities and gifts have been missed. Does this mean that schools have a moral obligation to focus on early identification? And wouldn't we rejoice if statistics from our Catholic schools indicated that very few of our pupils are ever sent to alternative provisions with unidentified special educational needs? It's not just what the pupils miss that should concern us. It's also the prevalence of special educational needs among young offenders. Research carried out by the Educational Psychology team in 2017 on young people in custody has revealed the following levels of special educational needs. 60 to 90% of offenders have speech, language, and communication needs compared to 10% of the general population. 30% of offenders have diagnosis of ADHD, 5 times higher than the general population. 20% have identified learning disabilities compared to 2.3% of the general population. Estimates for offenders with dyslexia range from 43 to 57% compared to 10% of the general population. 50 to 80% of offenders have suffered traumatic brain injury compared to 10% of the general population. Around 90% of offenders have been excluded from school at any one time, compared to 3.5% of the general population. 63% of young offenders who are boys and 74% of young offenders who are girls had been permanently excluded. And around 40% of young people who end up in custody have not been to school since they were 14. This percentage rises to 90% not attending before they reach 16 years of age. According to the Timpson Review, 23% of young offenders sentenced to less than 12 months in custody had been permanently excluded from schools. Not identifying special educational needs can be deadly serious. And most pupils in alternative provisions are identified as having social, emotional, and mental health needs. Post-pandemic statistics indicate that eating disorders have gone up by 400% among young people, and now 1 in 6 children has mental health difficulties when it used to be 1 in 9. Many of our children who are persistently excluded come from some of the most disadvantaged backgrounds. They need help and support to develop their resilience and improve their life chances through education, not exclusions. An NSPCC analysis of serious case reviews showed that 31% of serious violence victims had received a fixed-term exclusion. Victims, not perpetrators. Will this statistic make us review our exclusion policies and processes for early identification of needs? It is important to note that schools who did not use alternative provisions said that they had consistent approaches in place to manage behaviour. In fact, in 2019, the study by England's Children's Commissioner found that 88% of exclusions take place in only 10% of schools. This means that most schools can identify the needs of pupils at risk of exclusion and put into place the right support to help them stay in school and progress. Years ago, I worked with a teenager who, for the purposes of this workshop, I will call Daniel. Daniel was a Black Caribbean boy from a disadvantaged background, and his siblings dealt drugs. Daniel qualified for the pupil premium, and through the excellent work of the SEND team, had been identified in Year 7 as having speech and language difficulties and processing difficulties. He was unable to understand inference, subtlety, or sarcasm, and so when told off, more often than not, he lashed out. From Year 8 into Year 9, Daniel clashed with most members of staff. He spent most of his school day either in my classroom or in the on-site inclusion unit. Although staff set him work, he was unable to complete it given his learning needs. The teacher was not at fault. Daniel needed to be in class to access the learning, and so, unfortunately, by the time Year 9 was ending, he was identified as the pupil who was most at risk of permanent exclusion. The SEND team, Special Educational Needs team, the pastoral team, and Daniel's form tutor met and planned. What followed was a programme of targeted interventions and support for Daniel, alongside staff training in strategies to manage his behaviour, support his learning, and move his progress on. Daniel was there with his year group for the end of Year 11, end of year celebration. At the end, he got up and addressed the school. All he said was, "Thank you for keeping me." Approximately 70% of pupils in alternative provisions are boys, and Black Caribbean, Gypsy, Roma, and Traveller pupils are overrepresented. In schools that use exclusion regularly, Daniel would have probably been permanently excluded. And if he had been, he would have become a statistic we have encountered before. Black Caribbean boys, men are overrepresented, ... In 2017, the Lamy Review into the treatment of and outcomes for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic individuals in the criminal justice system found that despite making up just 14% of the population, BAME men and women make up 25% of prisoners, while over 40% of young people in custody are from BAME backgrounds. In addition, Gypsies, Roma, and Travellers are often missing from published statistics about children in the criminal justice system, but according to unofficial estimates, are substantially overrepresented in youth custody. For example, making up 12% of children in secure training centres. If we return to schools, this depressing fact is also present. Edward Timpson found that pupils with several characteristics have multiple risks of exclusion. Picture two fictional pupils with different characteristics and backgrounds. Let me introduce Nathan and Rachel. Nathan is a Black Caribbean boy. He has an EHCP for moderate learning difficulties. He lives in a deprived area and comes from a disadvantaged background. He attends a maintained secondary school. Rachel is a Black African girl, does not have special educational needs, and is an average ability student. She lives in an affluent area and too attends a secondary maintained school where very few pupils are excluded, if any. Nathan has a 2.3% chance of being permanently excluded compared to Rachel, who has a 0.3% chance of exclusion. This figure rises significantly with fixed term exclusions, with Nathan facing a 58% chance compared to Rachel's 11% chance. Some of these boys, just by the law of probability, will fall into Lammy's statistics. Has the colour of their skin and their sex changed their outcomes? 70% of pupils in alternative provisions are boys. The data Timpson analysed cannot tell us what impact any one characteristic has or the association between characteristics. In addition, the data does not include information about home life and other out-of-school factors that can have a negative impact on pupil behaviour in school. However, with that said, will we find that overrepresentation in some of our Catholic schools? And if we do, why? And what are they going to do to address it? The statistics are extremely worrying, as most permanent exclusions are for persistent, disruptive behaviour. As you can imagine, this is a very subjective term. It is even subjective at a classroom level. What I can manage in my class may not be what the teacher next door can manage. One teacher may send a pupil to the inclusion unit for shouting aggressively, whilst another teacher will respond to the same incident by placing the pupil outside the classroom, giving them time to cool down, then addressing the issue there and then. The pupil returns to the classroom, the issue is resolved, and learning continues. All schools should have the right pastoral systems in place and train all teachers to develop the right skills to deal with behaviour, so that they constantly remain a calm and safe environment where all pupils can access the high quality education they deserve. There is no doubt that the variation in behaviour management allowed at a teacher level feeds into the variation in the use of exclusion between schools. In an outstanding school, I'm sure we'll find there is little variation at a teacher level. I will finish this section with this concept of off-rolling. Off-rolling is the practice of removing a pupil from the school role without using a permanent exclusion, when the removal is primarily in the best interest of the school rather than in the best interest of the pupil. This includes pressuring a parent to remove their child from the role. In most cases that Timpson came across, it was unlawful. I wonder how many of us have worked in schools where this practice has occurred. It is simply unacceptable and should never be found in Catholic schools. In 2016-17, 80 pupils were unlawfully excluded for more than 45 days in one academic year. Let us now move on to the recommendations Timpson made. I will only focus on 3 and some questions they raise for our schools. For me, the most urgent must be the 45 days a pupil can be excluded for in any one academic year. The DfE should consult on options to address children with multiple exclusions being left without access to education. Surely by day 10, day 15, no? Well, how about day 20? The pastoral team and head teacher have recognised that exclusion as a tool to tackle poor behaviour is not working with that pupil. Can you even imagine the impact 20 days of exclusion may have on a child and their family? If one of the parents must be at home and both parents are working, one will have to take time off work. Will it be paid, unpaid? Will they use some of their holiday allocation? Will that parent reveal the real reason for their unplanned and urgent request for time off? I need the whole of next week off for personal reasons. I'm just not sure how I'd phrase it. Does this cross our mind as we watch a parent shout and gesticulate wildly after being told their child is to be excluded? Do we then respond compassionately and gently, Or do we efficiently and quietly move the parent out of the school with their problem child? The second recommendation is to remove the financial incentives to exclude. DfE should look carefully at the timing and amounts of any adjustments to schools' funding following exclusion to make sure they neither act as an incentive for schools to permanently exclude a pupil at any particular times, nor discourage a school from admitting a child who has been permanently excluded from elsewhere. The head teacher of a school can exclude a pupil on disciplinary grounds only. The decision must be lawful, reasonable, and fair. In addition, schools and local authorities must arrange alternative provision from the 6th day of the exclusion of pupils of compulsory age. If schools were made to fully fund the placement of a pupil in an alternative, fixed term or permanently, alternative provision, would exclusion rates drop? And finally, the third recommendation, which I believe will be the most significant for schools, to make schools accountable for the results of excluded pupils. If this recommendation is fully actioned, will schools with high numbers of excluded pupils quickly carry out an audit of their behaviour policy? Will schools redefine persistent disruptive behaviour and implement more effective strategies to deal with poor behaviour for learning? Will communication between the parents of pupils at risk of exclusion and the school improve? Will there be a noticeable drop in the number of exclusions? Will there be less variation in exclusions between schools? As we come to the final part of my talk, I'll give you a moment to perhaps think about a student you know who has been permanently excluded. What year were they in when they left? What were they like? Do you remember why they were excluded? And what else did they miss when they left their Catholic school? The religious education curriculum from the Catholic Education Service states that the primary purpose of Catholic religious education is to come to know and understand God's revelation, which is fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. The Catholic school is a clear educational project of which Christ is the foundation. In the person of Christ, the deepest meaning of what is to be human, that we are created by God, and through the Holy Spirit united with Christ in his incarnation, is discovered. It goes on to say that this revelation is known through the scriptures and the tradition of the church as taught by the magisterium. Religious education helps the pupil to know and experience the meaning of this revelation in his or her own life and the life of the community, which is the church. Hence, the promotion of the human person is the goal of the Catholic school. Religious education is central to the curriculum of the Catholic school and is at the heart of the philosophy of Catholic education. I'll repeat that. Religious education is at the heart of the philosophy of Catholic education, from which everything else stems. Pope Benedict said that education is not and must never be considered as purely utilitarian. It is about forming the human person, equipping him or her to live life to the full. In short, it is about imparting wisdom. There are no facts or figures for us to see what proportion of pupils are excluded from Catholic schools, nor do we know at which stage of their formation are they excluded. It's all unknown and perhaps not relevant. However, religious educators delivering lessons on God the Father, marriage and family life, celibacy and religious life, etc., head teachers, pastoral and academic deputies, all subscribing to Catholic education, may need to stop and ask, should we exclude even one of our pupils? As they may turn and say, Lord, whom do we turn to now? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asha. I'm going to move straight on because we're a little bit raced for time. I'm going to introduce our second speaker to you now, Father Phil Sumner, who served as a priest in Moss Silent Home in Manchester for 25 years. He now is the parish priest of Our Lady in St. Patrick's in Oldham. He is a canon lawyer and now a judge of the Salford Diocesan Metropolitan Tribunal. He, we proudly say, is a trustee of CARJ. He was the first chair of the Oldham Interfaith Forum and now serves as a trustee and project manager in a voluntary capacity. On 2 occasions, Father Phil had been a witness on BBC 4's The Moral Maze. Father Phil is one of the team of presenters for the BBC Radio 4 daily service. You might listen to those. Today, Father Phil will reflect on how the Catholic community might support all concerned. Father Phil.
Father, you're on mute. Father, can you hear? You're muted.
Yeah, I've come to it now. Yeah, so I can share my screen now, I hope. And go into my slideshow. Okay, we'll get there yet. So from the beginning. So you can see from here, changing role of the parish in Catholic schools to enable them to be inclusive organizations, inclusive communities. For me here now in Oldham, so much of that is about working with the different faith communities as well. So you see myself there with a local mufti. We go into about 40 schools in the area to model our particular friendship and the idea that if we can get on together, then surely they can. But the different changes as well are taking place with so many multi-academy trusts either being in existence or being proposed at the moment. And surely this takes it into much larger establishments, much larger organizations, run more perhaps on business lines. And the role of the priest becomes something very different. The role of the parish becomes something very different. And we need to think about that. Right at the forefront of that is the term the Catholic ethos. What does the Catholic ethos mean? I ask every teacher that comes to me for, well, certainly the senior staff, head teachers, deputy heads and others that comes to me for an interview for a job, how do you know whether something is Catholic? How do you know whether what you're teaching represents Catholic teaching? And so often they would say things like, oh, well, I'd come and ask you, Father. Like, it's pretty well no use. People need to know that the basics for finding out whether something is Catholic is what does the Bible say and what does tradition say? And in the Bible and tradition, you've got 2 very basic statements that I would refer to today. One is from Luke chapter 4, which sets out that project, as it were, for Jesus as he's setting off on his mission. And he comes out with that famous passage about freeing captives, giving the blind new sight. And if we're going to be a school with a Catholic ethos, we certainly need to be one where it is good news to the poor and to those often excluded from society. If that's not an obvious part of what we're about as a school, then there's something wrong. Is it Catholic? And then also the compendium of the social doctrine of the church. There you can read on paragraph 52, social doctrine of the church. Church communities offer themselves, surely, as places of communion and as catalysts for the redemption and transformation of social relationships. So much of our role as priests, as people involved in the parish, as people that help out in schools, as teachers, whatever, but certainly those in the parish level is about advocacy. One of our, I won't say his name, but one of our altar servers, was an absolute brilliant altar server here. But when he was in school, he just got into trouble every single day. And he was in one of those inclusion units within the school. And again, because of advocacy, which was welcomed by the school from the parish, people were able to see through the deeper things about his family, but to know about his family where his mother didn't really want him, his dad wasn't on the scene at all, his granny had a heart failure problem and he stayed with his grandmother who could die at any stage. So there were obvious problems there, and it needed somebody from the parish besides the school to stand there and be a friend in that situation. And he was, like the one that Asha mentioned, there to the end. Actually, he's moved down to London now from up here. And then people in the wider parish can often have a greater understanding of the cultural practices of particular groups. So within African groups, many of you will know that if you're getting told off, you look, as a child, you look down. You don't look in the eyes of the person who's telling you off. Some people in the European culture would see that as an insult and tell you off again. But people need to know that there are different responses from different people, especially within Roma and traveller groups of people as well. There's so much need for advocacy, so much need for an understanding of the cultural practices of the different communities. Simply to be a support to many of our children in these situations, to help them to be able to stay in education. And then when it comes to things like what goes on in the school, there are a recent report that many of you will have heard of by Tony Sewell. Well, he was the chair of the reporting group, Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. And we need to be able to challenge what he's come out with. For example, he suggests that there have been 3 ages for the African Caribbean community. There was the age of the heroic age where, and I know there are many people from the Black communities, African descent communities here in Britain long before Windrush, but he talks about the Windrush generation as being the heroic age, where people stretch out from the Caribbean or wherever and reach out and become a part of another country. Then there's the age of rebellion, the 70s and the 80s. I was in Moss Side at the time of the riots in the 80s and got sent here after the riots in Oldham. But then he suggests now we're in an age of participation. And he suggests all sorts of figures that show that people now from the Black communities, from other communities, are actually becoming, going into places, in high places in business, high places in education, high places in parliament, and there are figures to show that. But what's your perception of that? I suspect the people that I speak to, especially in the African Caribbean community, would say, well, there may be a bit of a change. There's an advert on at the moment about Black History Month. And there's a person working in theatre there that says, yes, the gatekeepers are beginning to change, but we're still right at the beginning. You can't really call it an age of participation yet. We're just beginning to get some movement. So we need to be able to address those things and challenge those things. The other thing that he comes out with is that addressing failure for children in schools is often about simply increasing the hours in a school day for everybody. Now, I'm referring again to the African descent community here, but Dr. Jocelyn Maxime, a Black woman clinical psychologist from London, did some research back in the 90s, 1990s that is, and she showed that she took 3 groups, one that did no extra work at all, one group that did Saturday schools. You know that some of the African Caribbean children will go to Saturday schools and do extra work. And the 3rd group did identity nurturing within education itself, within the system. Those that even went to Saturday schools after year 9 dropped off their motivation for education. Whereas those that did racial identity nurturing through the curriculum and across the curriculum maintained their level of motivation for education right through to the end of schooling. Now, I know it's 1990s and it's quite a long time ago, But there are people like Macpherson and others in their reports, the Lawrence report, that recognize the importance of identity. We're beginning to lose that because of the reaction against multiculturalism. Use of the pupil premium that Asha referred to, not just for addressing leaking roofs, but for addressing identity, for getting a greater understanding on how you can do that. There's great work by the Leicester Authority way back again called Young, Gifted and Equal, but many other schools have also, many other education areas have also developed that. But again, because of the work, the reaction to multiculturalism, so much of that has been dropped. And then there's the use of pupil premium to support families. So many of the families, because of social deprivation, because of their history in their family, their personal history, have a dreadful start. And they need to have that support given to them, that extra support that parishes and others can do so much better than the school that's trying to focus on other things, although I hope the school does that as well. And then there's the white privilege phrase and the critical race theory. Kemi Badenoch, she referred to people who talk about critical race theory in schools, this systemic racism that goes on. If you address that, if you mention that and don't talk about other people who don't agree with it, then you are in danger of doing something illegal. I accept that critical race theory in this country is not as stark as in the United States, but there are people who, because of their, say for example, the African Caribbean community or the Gypsy, Roma and traveller community, because of their history, because of the social disadvantage that they often work with. It isn't just about the social disadvantage, it is about personal histories and relationships to the rest of society. And because of that, they suffer a lot more than other communities. I don't think that's accepted sufficiently by Sewell, but that's another matter. Then there's work in school or youth club. And beyond, because I can remember a time walking through Forest Bank prison up in Salford here, and I was walking through one of the wings with the chaplain, and as we were walking through, one of the prisoners came running up to us, absolutely enthusiastic. Why? Because he'd been on a course where his wife had been able to come into the prison and talk through their relationships, talk through where they were going and why they were going wrong in their relationships. And he was so enthusiastic about this. And if you remember, some of the figures given by Asha talked about the problem of communication. Communication is absolutely essential for relationships. And if you can't talk to each other, it's going to come up on the rocks at some time or another. And she gave the figures, Asha gave the figures of 60 to 90% of those in prisons have this problem of communication and language, whereas only 10% of the ordinary population have that. So that's work with relationships, not just in prison, but also at schools, to me, is massively important. Another way of creating an inclusive environment in the school where people feel as though a bit of time is under, people who work with them, they have a role model there and different things like that. So we've worked in the past with Black artists. So with this picture that you can see on the screen, we asked an African Caribbean artist to work with some of our Year 9 pupils to do a painting that would celebrate African presence, African descent presence in the church. This is about 6 foot by 4 foot painting that sits on the wall immediately opposite the main door of the church in Moss Side. Now, I left Moss Side 20 years ago, but that painting must mean something to people because it's still there on the wall 20 years later. It was done about 25 years ago altogether now. So that's another element of being able to create an inclusive approach. Creating networks through different communities of expertise. So if people are working in CAFOD, for example, or have no families from different groups, they could actually create links between people in different countries and the children in our schools. And this is seen by Ofsted as one example of actually doing something that could be seen as outstanding. And then also to reclaim places symbolically. Gooch Close in Moss Side was a place that gave its name to one of the gangs, the two main gangs of the area. I was visiting in Moss Side and Gooch Close on one occasion and went into an African descent man's household. And as I looked round the room, there were acrylic paintings with fantastic, vibrant colors all around the room. I said, where did they come from? And he said, I did them. And I asked him immediately if he would paint our Stations of the Cross. He took on the job. And it was interesting that the picture of the crucifixion was clearly that of a disabled man, which he was himself. His legs were shorter. He had difficulty walking, had to use crutches. He saw himself on that cross. To me, this was a great symbol for the reclaiming of Gooch Close. And I think there are important symbols like that that come up at different times. Choosing appropriate role models for display, like McCoy, Elijah McCoy. Some of you will remember quite a few years ago now, there's a comedy program, Black interest comedy program put on by African descent people called The Real McCoy. Why? Because Elijah McCoy was somebody in the States who created a system, a locomotive system that everybody in the States wanted. Well, everybody that was involved in locomotive machines. And they used to ask, is it the real McCoy? So that was the phrase. Now, Elijah McCoy certainly is on the wall of one of our secondary schools in this area here. So I know that it is important to some people. Choosing reading materials which reflects the experience of the class. If people are reading and they don't see anything of their own experience, they just go into a different world altogether, sometimes that can be important. But other times they need to find something of themselves when they are represented, when they can see there's something of me here. If that doesn't happen, then it's not an inclusive school. Then in geography, addressing overseas development. So often we give the example, if CAFOD is working with groups, of the poor in Africa and all this, whereas the reality can be that the mineral wealth of so many of the African countries is an amazing wealth. And there's so much dignity to be recognized in so many of these places, not just because of the wealth that's there, but because of the wealth of the humanity that's there. And we need to do far more work on showing that. Then using parish links to study another community, which I've already mentioned, making it clear that refugees are welcome to counter the sort of thing that you can see there on that flag, but at the same time to recognize that there has to be a limit, that it isn't just open house, otherwise you start to affect the stability in a community and in a country. Finally, come down to interfaith work, which is another element of inclusivity as well. And from a church point of view, many people, when I came to this parish, justified racism towards Pakistanis and Bangladeshis on the basis of faith. And of course, the big English Defence League and others hold their flags, the St. George's flags, the Oldham division there of the English Defence League, as if it is a crusade, another crusade. We need to reclaim that flag. And one way of doing that is to reclaim a Christian approach, a genuinely Christian approach to the Crusades, which I don't think was there in some of the popes at the time of the Crusades. For example, St. Francis of Assisi, many people will not know, but some do, of Francis going to the Crusades in Egypt, to Damietta, and trying to talk to the soldiers to get them to stop fighting. And he was ridiculed by them. So himself and one of his other brothers, Franciscan brothers, went across the battle lines and asked to speak to the Sultan, Sultan Kamil. Amazingly, he was given hospitality, and for over 2 weeks they taught, because he was seen to be not a combatant, but a person of faith, he was given hospitality, and they taught for 2 weeks, sharing understanding of faiths, and both sides were amazingly impressed by what they found. Pope Francis, of course, when he became Pope, chose the name Francis, partly because of the poverty message that's involved there, but also because of the knowledge that he had of Francis of Assisi and the Sultan Kamil. So he quite deliberately went to Egypt himself to meet with the Grand Imam of Egypt, and they formed a great friendship. Now, the knowledge of these sort of things within Catholic schools, within the sort of things that we do, can give a different approach that enables greater inclusivity again. So for me, to conclude, inclusion is about advocacy and support, doing what we can to support those young people that have got problems by sharing our understanding of cultures and things like that, helping the schools to understand when they don't necessarily understand and couldn't be expected to. Creating an ethos that reflects gospel imperatives. You've seen the two that I put there from the two different, one from the Bible and one from tradition. Creating a curriculum that enables people to belong. There's so much work that can be done on that, and we haven't got time for that now. And then you also see Black Lives Matter, the poster there held as he takes the knee by an archbishop or a bishop in the States. We know that there are issues about how people see the organization or the leaders of Black Lives Matter, but Black lives do matter, and it is important at times for those symbolic taking of the knee and to show that support, not necessarily for everything that is said by the organization, but for Black lives being important, as are many other lives too, of course, all lives. And then a phrase that I will finish with that I think Asha touched on, but I think it's so important. A person will only accept the values of a society or a school when he or she feels valued themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Paul. Thank you to both you and Asha for fantastic presentations. I'm chasing a little bit because I know that we're running short of time. We now have 15 minutes. We're going to go into breakout rooms. I'm going to ask that everybody in the breakout room uses the chat facility to put in any kind of comment you want to make or questions you wish to ask. If you put it in the chat, please, so that we can get it afterwards. Also, just to remind you that the questions have been put into the chat. So Asha will give you 3 questions now, but they will be in the chat for your discussion. If you find one person in the group that would kind of make sure that everybody participates, and also that we have a scribe to bring back the information from the groups, from the discussion to the plenary year after. We're going to give you 15 minutes in which to do these. The 3 questions that Asha has put up, I'm going to read through them very, very quickly. According to the Sewell report, we are in an age of participation where ethnic minorities have been able to participate better than in the past. And they're gone, Asha.
Sorry.
What is your experience? How can we get better at identifying sin earlier in our schools? And why are some of our most vulnerable pupils being identified with sin after they have been placed in an alternative provision? 3, what statistics could you expect from a Catholic school and why? And then number 4, any other thoughts or comments you wish to make? So I'd like you to come back at 1:15. I know it's a big ask. You have 15 minutes to answer all 3 those questions, to discuss those 3 questions. Thank you. Gloria, will you put us into our breakout groups, please?
Okay, just a second, and I might change a few people around. Hope you don't mind.
We're back again.
Okay, 1 second, 1 second.
Poor Elizabeth. Richard and myself were in a group with Elizabeth.
Just a second, just a second. I'll need to mute the recording.
Okay.
So, thank you. Thank you for coming back sharply. And we've got about 10 minutes. And what I'd like now is for if each group would just take a minute to report back so that Father Phil and Asha could hear what your discussion was about. And if there are any questions, we could see if we could answer them before the end of our session. And where we can't, we'll do our best to try and get answers to come back to you. Is that okay? Could we start with group 1, please?
You're muted, Alison. You're muted.
Michael, you're okay now.
Yeah. Are you happy if I feedback from our group?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually an academy leader. I work for the Diocese of Westminster Academy Trust. So, you know, thank you for the presentations, and a lot of it's given me food for thought around the reality. I think, you know, in terms of have things transformed and are things better for minority ethnic communities? Not really. You know, I think we agree there's a long way to go, and I think that we need to make sure that our schools are sort of open and inclusive and are encouraging sort of participation, but also challenging discrimination. And a piece of work that I did this year was around the sort of diversity of our leadership teams. And we do have difficulties recruiting Catholic leaders, but I've been reflecting on how we need to start to identify talent from minority ethnic and other communities so that we can start to have, you know, our diverse pupil body sees leaders and teachers who reflect their lives. Otherwise, you know, how do people ever think they can be that person in the future? So if anything, that report, you know, there are grains of it that ring right, but it's a bit of a broad brush, and we should, you know, it's not an excuse to do nothing, is it? It actually in some ways has spurred me on to think more deeply about equality, diversity and inclusion. On the second area around SEND, we had a discussion around, you know, why isn't SEND identified early enough? I put my sort of what my belief on the line is that SEND is not well enough funded, so it's very difficult to get identification. And I think working in the sector with children from nursery age through to, you know, going to university, I think a smaller setting is almost better placed to contain children with special educational needs, and then they move to a very big school, and it's that, you know, they've coped in a smaller setting in a class that doesn't move around, so they are then coming into a bigger school with real challenges, perhaps with literacy, perhaps falling behind their friends, perhaps not being able to keep up the pace, and that will manifest in disruptive behavior or angry behavior. And I reflected that there's a job for the emerging academy trusts to sort of recognize what the problems are later on and work with the primary schools and make sure there's resource that we can challenge local authorities around educational healthcare plans, that we can get early interventions in around speech and language, because, you know, early intervention around speech and language can really have an impact and prevent children from needing specialist resource later on. So, you know, there's such a role for this emerging sector, the school sector, to really use the resources in a pooled way to make things better. And then finally, what was the last one? The last one, it was around what a Catholic school, what should we see in a Catholic school? And I was really taken around that sort of, your presentation, Father, around sort of how the parish can be involved in advocacy and support. And we discussed, making sure that the environment is welcoming to everybody and that you've got a carefully thought out curriculum. I'm going to take it back to our CEO and we're going to sort of look at that in our strand. Will people who feel included be more likely to engage? And that then feeds into, do you get better opportunities if you feel that if you feel marginalized? Do you lose heart early on? Whereas if you feel part of a community and involved in that community, so that's our job as Catholic educators, isn't it? To provide a space where all our diverse pupils and our staff feel that this is a space where they can thrive, and that will give them, confidence when they move on to the next phase of their lives.
Thank you very much, Marcon. I'm going to ask for group 2, and I'm going to say, please, can you stick to just 2 minutes? Otherwise, we won't get through all 4 groups. That's all right. That's all right. Don't worry. We'll go on to group 2, please. Somebody from group 2?
You need to unmute. You need to unmute if you're going to speak.
Do we have somebody from group 2? There's nobody yet.
I'm not sure if I was in group 2.
Yeah, that's right. I think Declan, we were in group 2.
Thank you, Anton. Yeah, we spoke about several different things, test my memory. We couldn't quite remember all the questions because we didn't have them available in our chat. So we started talking about the age of participation and how that's evolving within communities, and that there is progress being seen across the board. We had viewpoints from Sister Teresa's work in Pakistan, as well as Anton's experience in Sri Lanka as well, and from my experience within the traveller movement, specifically looking at Gypsy, Roma and traveller children. So there is progress, but there is significant disruption still that comes from tradition, that comes from community stigma. I said that I was in a meeting earlier today where I was speaking to a local authority who said that they had 200 children identified as Gypsy, Roma or traveller in primary school, but only 14 were signed up to go to secondary school. So there are huge issues within the community, and something that we're developing as a movement is the idea of self or constructive exclusion, where families or children purposefully exclude themselves or are excluded from a school, not necessarily through a formal exclusion process, but because they don't believe that their place is in that educational institution. So that's something that we're working on. We had discussions around that. I'll keep it short because I know we need to keep within the 2 minutes, but the last thing that we touched upon is how to harness Catholicism to impact communities and the great messages that Catholicism can have, and the power that it has within particular communities. I use the Irish travelling community as an example that is predominantly very Catholic, and the impact and how serious the community members take that and how we can use that within education. And I think there's also a wider question, not just in how we can use that within, say, Catholic schools, but how we can use that within the Academy Trust that Father Phil spoke to us about. How can we use the great messages of Catholicism to push educational attainment forward. Anton said, no, Sister Teresa said about two sisters in her area who were helping Gypsy Roma traveller children with I think their confirmation. I think, yes, I got a nod. And how seriously they're taking that education and how much they want to be confirmed. Is there a way that we can use that message and that enrichment for education in their other subjects in school to help them achieve, to help them get those goals, and to avoid all of the the outcomes, the poor outcomes that Asha so eloquently outlined for us earlier on in the first session. I'll hand back now.
Thank you ever so much, Declan. I'm going to go immediately to Elizabeth in group 3. Elizabeth, can you unmute and report back for us, please?
Thank you, Yogi. Yes, in our group we had Michael, myself and Veronica. Unfortunately, Veronica's microphone wasn't working, so we've tried our best to sort of muddle through this. Question 1 on the age of participation. Myself and Michael, we have, I'd say, very similar backgrounds in education experience in the UK, similar makeup of schools, but I'm in London, he was in Liverpool. The majority of kids were white, and there was a minority of black kids who did experience some racism, being sidelined and excluded as well. In secondary school, for me personally, I went to an all-girls secondary school, and my experience was that the black girls were excluded. And very often I could see, from what I can see now, actually, retrospectively, because I've become a teacher and I've had more than 20 years teaching experience now, I could see that they were under-challenged, that they were very much ostracised, and there were definite prejudices by the teachers at the time there in a Catholic school in West London as well, I might add. For question 2, you're talking about SEND. Michael suggested something like psychometric testing, if that could be done. The question would be whether that would be appropriately read and then appropriately assessed so that students could be directed in the correct way. We understand that SEN is understood more, and it's a matter of teacher training so that teachers can identify things and issues readily and early on for early intervention. For number 3, statistics from a Catholic school, we weren't really sure, didn't get the whole question, but with regard to exclusions, a lovely big fat 0 be ideal. But we could also say too that some schools would do it as a matter of self-preservation to protect their school name and not have it tarnished by any kids who behave inappropriately and such like. That's what we conclude. I think that's my 2 minutes done.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And our last group then, group 4.
I'm not sure we had a group 4, but I might be mistaken.
No. Okay. I think that is it. I'm going to give Father Phil 1 minute and then Asha 1 minute if you have anything to say to the people, to what has just been said from the 3 groups.
Well, I would come in straight away and say, in terms of the multi-academy trusts, that unless we actually proactively address the changing situation, we will fail again. It is a changing situation. We need to readjust how we do things. Otherwise, you're not going to have religious sisters coming into the school and doing this work if we don't actually proactively organize it in a way as a church community. So it is about not sitting back and just hoping it will happen. We've got to do something about it.
Thanks, Father Phil. Asha?
I'll unmute myself, yes. I think it's just, we're all dealing in schools with the post-pandemic issues, and they are huge, diverse, depending on where you are in the country, the affluence of your pupils, etc. And even then, it's a different need that is presented. I just would hope that the statistics are always kept in mind of disadvantaged pupils, because they can be lost and forgotten. And it's the young offending, the young offender statistics that most disturbed me. Until I carried out this research, I wasn't even aware of those statistics. So when we do exclude a pupil, we increase those chances. And so I would hope from this talk, there's more reflection. Do we really need to permanently exclude that pupil? Is there really nothing else we can do to keep them in our schools? But thank you very much again.
Thank you, Asha. I just want to conclude. I'll just conclude with one little thing, and all of you people who are in education will remember Father Paddy Purnell, a Jesuit, who had written several books on education, but one of his very first books spoke of the triangle of the home, the school, and the church, and the connection for community, for being in communion. And we as Catholics are in communion one with the other. So for teachers and for the hierarchy within our schools, the most important thing is to, as Father Phil says, to nurture the identity of those young people, to protect and to care for them. The nurturing should be part of our trying our darndest to keep them in school. But if it comes to a push where they move out of the school, where we have to find alternative education for them, that they're not forgotten, that these young people are monitored, that we show as Catholics, we're still in communion. We want to make sure that that little girl, that little boy's potential is for the best, that we get the best out of that young person, and that young person moves on in life and is not forgotten. So I don't know if every one of you have a copy in your schools, but it was a big thing when I was teaching to have the book by Father Paddy Purnell to show us that, one cannot do without the other. We should be working together, as Father Phil does. He doesn't only look after his parish, he looks after the schools, and he looks after the families between those parishes and the school, so that the community is one caring for the other. I want to say a very, very big thank you to Asha and to Father Phil, yet again, for giving up the very precious time to do this most interesting and, I think, important work for us. Just to say to everybody else that we're hoping this is going to be ongoing, and that we will have a working group to work on exclusions, to look forward to inclusion. So thank you all for coming today. Richard, was there one last thing you wanted to say?
Just as you said, that we're going to keep this in the front of our minds, and we're going to work on it in one way or another, and we'll try to keep in touch with you and others like yourselves as we move this forward.
Thank you, Richard. And
about the AGM, please, Yogi.
And I was just about to say, and a big thank you to Gloria for organizing and for setting everything up. So thank you, Gloria, for all the work in the background there. And yes, and Gloria's right. The first Saturday of November is the CARJ AGM, and you're all very, very welcome. We'll be doing it by Zoom this year. So wherever you are, you could join us. And if you're interested, if you can leave your email address with Gloria, she will send you a link for the Zoom. And on that note, may I say thank you to everybody. Sorry that we took up an extra 4 minutes of your time. God bless. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.